I'd like to thank Nancy Toff for inviting me to speak to you today at the New York Flute Club about flutes from the early years of the United States. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, this seems an ideal time to look back on flute making in the United States during its first 150 years. As was the case with the European countries, the U.S. has had a long and varied history of flute making. While that history is similar to other countries, it is unique in many ways. The U.S. had many fine and well-known flute makers, especially during the 19th century. If you were a flutist in 1776, what would you have played on, and what music would you have played? At that time, there were no native-born American flute makers, and most people interested in the flute would have been playing on instruments imported from Europe. In many cases, instruments would have been brought to America with people emigrating from Europe. The first people to make flutes in the U.S. would have been makers who moved from Europe to the U.S. Of course, there would have been flutes from Native American peoples, but those are outside the range of this presentation. A publication from Williamsburg, Virginia, in the late 18th century mentions the German flute, a common name for the transverse flute at this time, as being an instrument performed on by a gentleman, as opposed to the guitar, which was considered a lady's instrument. These first instruments were equivalent to the simpler of the instruments being made in Europe, usually with only one key. Most flutists would have focused on playing tunes, such as those from Ireland, Scotland, England, as well as tunes composed in the U.S., many of which would have had military or political connotations. These tunes were generally not specifically flute music, but rather repertoire shared with the fiddle or other melody instruments. If you were shopping for a flute in 1776, you would most likely find either German or English one-key instruments available, but most probably only in the more important cities. It would be unusual to find an inexpensive instrument, as the need for large quantities of cheaper instruments was not yet a priority. Once we get into the 19th century, however, the Industrial Revolution allowed flutes to be made in much greater numbers and with cheaper models becoming readily available. Some flutes were being imported, but many were being made in America by makers such as Firth Hall and Pond, Pellaby, Riley, Close, Badger, Whitley, or many other makers. In New York City alone, we know of at least 42 woodwind makers. Boston and Philadelphia also had quite a few makers. One of the big differences between buying a flute now versus buying a flute in the 19th century is that we now have one general type of flute that everyone plays, that being a metal or rarely a wooden Böhm flute. In the 19th century, one had a huge choice of different types of flutes. Flutes from different countries were different from one another in many ways, and one could buy a French, English, American, or German flute with 1, 4, 5, 6, 8, or more keys, and made from many different types of wood or even of ivory. These differences were substantial and represented a vast difference in price from a one-key flute to a much fancier flute with 8 or more keys. Eventually, the Böhm flutes were added into this mix at an even higher price. I think it's useful to examine several makers and their flutes in more detail. One of my very favorite American makers was Chabrier Pelloubet. Pelloubet was a wind instrument maker first, and from the three flutes by Pelloubet currently in my collection, it is easy to see a wide range in price, style, and function of American flutes. The flute on the top of this photo is a basic one-key flute in D. This would have been a relatively inexpensive instrument, and flutes like this could be purchased at any music store or department store with a musical instrument area, which was a common thing to find. This flute is made of stained boxwood with ivory rings and a brass key. To demonstrate my one-key Pelloubet flute, I'd like to play a selection from Blake's Selected Beauties for the German Flute, consisting of favorite airs with variations and embellishments. And this was published by Blake himself in Philadelphia somewhere around 1820. The tune is called O Nanny, Wilt Thou Gang With Me, marked Andante, and it's arranged by the composer Karl Saust. The tune means basically, "O Nanny, will you go with me?" And it was the title is kind of in pseudo-Scottish dialect. The tune itself dates back as early as 1773, where it was in some kind of a stage production in London. But it was common for the tunes like this to reappear then in many different books of ornamented airs for the flute or the violin or other instruments. In this case, it's unusual because this is one of the first sources published in America that gives us these nice ornamented airs for the flute. This next selection is also from the Blake's Selected Beauties, and it's a tune called Coolin, Coolin, which is another sort of pseudo-Gaelic association. This was also arranged by Soust, and evidently the word is a version of what in Gaelic could mean the fair-haired one. I wouldn't have guessed that Coolin meant that, but evidently that was the case. So I'm playing this on my Pelabé F flute. So this is just like a normal D flute, except a minor third higher, so it's shorter. It's not like a piccolo, though it has a very lively sound to it, which I think is especially nice for playing these ornamented tunes. Another very interesting maker was William Ronberg. Ronberg was how they would have said it in America. He lived from 1803 to 1889 and was born in Hamburg, Germany. He started off as a maker of simple system flutes, but became very involved in the early days of the Böhm flute being made in America. We're very lucky to have a lengthy interview with Ronberg published in the New York Sun. It is very unusual to have first-hand accounts of what was involved in flute making in 19th century America. I used to make some flutes of ebony, but I shall make no more. The wood is treacherous. It splits easily, and take as much care as you may, your flute is likely to become worthless. I shall never use it. I will not make a flute which is liable to disappoint its owner. He also laments that the flute is not as much loved as it was previously. He says, "The time was when it was a favorite instrument, when young men of fashion learned to play it, when you heard famous players in concerts. Now that is past." He goes on to remark about silver flutes. "Yes, and they are not flutes. They are bastards, neither flutes nor horns." This was a fairly common opinion, even amongst composers, Wagner being a good example. Rönnberg did, in fact, make some silver flutes, but he considered them to be inferior to the wooden instruments. The Böhm flute finally comes to America, delayed by about 10 years from when it was becoming popular, especially in France. The first major manufacturer and promoter of the Böhm flute in America was A.G. Badger. Badger's shop was in New York City beginning in 1845. In 1847, he began making Böhm flutes, probably based on Böhm's conical 1832 model. Soon after Böhm introduced his cylindrical design in 1847, Badger began making cylindrical flutes in silver as well as various woods, and beginning in 1851 in ebonite. Ebonite was a material invented by George Goodyear of Goodyear Tires and Rubber, and Goodyear used Badger to prove the value of this new material in making woodwind instruments. It, in fact, had a lot of advantages over wood. Most importantly, it didn't crack or warp. Other American makers, especially Kahn, were quite convinced of the excellent qualities of ebonite. Many of Kahn's early series of flutes were made using an ebonite head joint and then a metal body for the flute. So that gave some of the quality that was similar to a wooden head joint but without cracking, and then the advantages that the silver body had. The Böhm flute, because of its complicated mechanism, was always going to be a more expensive type of flute than the simple system flutes, keyed flutes derived from the one-key Baroque flute, essentially, which continued to be popular. Badger made quite fancy big city flutes, featuring copious engravings and even ornamental shapes not necessary to the function of the flute. His workmanship was not as tied to the idea of either the popular German or French models. The initial models he had access to in learning to make Böhm flutes would have been French instruments, likely those of Louis Lot, or German flutes of Böhm and Mendler. You can see in this photo two different flutes made by Badger that are quite different from one another. The upper flute is a silver flute, quite beautifully made. You can see very interesting shapes in the head joint. It had what was known as a barrel embouchure, so instead of a lip plate to add height around the embouchure hole, there was a barrel that wraps all the way around the flute. This was very common in English instruments, and Badger initially used that technique in order to get height to the embouchure hole. The second instrument is also quite interesting. This is a very early ebonite instrument, so made of this special rubber, hardened rubber material that was invented by Goodyear. This was probably a very early flute of this type. This flute is based quite obviously on the designs of Louis Lott's wooden flutes. It has a very, very similar visual design, and probably acoustically is also very similar. Most American flute makers could not make large quantities of flutes with a lot of keys or the Böhm flutes, so importing flutes in large quantities was still quite common. Most often from Germany, through the major music firms in the US, such as Carl Fischer or Lyon and Healy in Chicago. In fact, the most popular keyed flute toward the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century would have been what we would now call the Nachmayer flute. The Nachmayer flutes were basically knockoffs of flutes designed by H.F. Meyer, a very famous maker from Hanover. These were commonly made with 8 or more keys, as was the German fashion at the time. They are the older non-Böhm flute most likely to be found at your local antique store. Their quality ranges to anything from a pretty nice high quality flute to a really pretty terrible flute. The famous Boston maker George Cluse even made his own version of the Nachmayer, which is much higher quality than the usual imported model. In this photo, you can see 3 flutes of slightly different designs. So at the top is an original flute from H.F. Meyer. This is actually quite an early one in this particular style of flute. We think that it was made at or before 1867, which is quite early for this model. Interestingly, this flute lived in Boston, and I actually have some of the paperwork about some additions that were made to the flute, replacing the usual metal cap with a nice wooden cap and putting a little metal plaque on it, which was a common style. And the quality of the flute itself is very high. So the second flute you can see in the photo is a Nachmayer flute, and it actually says Nach H.F. Meyer Hamburg, which means after H.F. Meyer, so copied from H.F. Meyer. And it's a pretty nice flute. It's not fully restored, so I really don't know how it plays, but it has 12 keys, which is a pretty advanced design. The final flute in the photograph is the flute in the Meyer style by Klose, who was a very important maker in Boston and New York. So not all American flutists just played tunes. While there's certainly less than would be found in European countries, there were real professional flutists in the United States. Probably the best known of these is Philip Ernst, who lived from 1792 to 1868. He was both a guitarist and flutist, and interestingly, he was initially trained as a gunsmith. He was born in Germany and spent the first half of his life in Europe, where he attained important positions such as flutist to the court of France. In 1830, with the revolution in France, he moved to England, where he became flutist to the Italian opera, replacing the very famous flutist Charles Nicholson. By 1841, Ernst had moved to New York, and in 1842, he became the first flute in the newly founded New York Philharmonic. We know that he was a player of the new Böhm flute and an important proponent of this instrument. In 1854, he hosted the very famous French flutist Louis Drouet in his visit to New York City. During that time, he introduced Drouet to the boom flute, something Drouet did not convert to. However, Drouet did dedicate his 72 studies on taste and style composed expressly for the boom flute. He dedicated those to Ernst. We know that Ernst purchased 8 flutes directly from Theobald Böhm himself. The practice of buying flutes, which were then sold to students, was commonplace. Like many high-level flutists in his day, Ernst was also a composer, writing mostly for the guitar or flute. Sometime in the 1820s, before immigrating to the United States, he composed a series of 20 arrangements of popular opera tunes for flute and guitar. These were published in Germany. While in America, Ernst did publish a few other flute pieces, but they were in a lighter, easier style, more fitting to the taste of American flutists. Here is a cavatina alla polacca, played on a Pelubé 8-key flute built in the English style, very similar to the flutes of Rudel and Rose of London. The piece is entitled From the Opera Adelaide from Carafa. Evidently, the opera is really by Rossini, but was sort of rearranged by Carafa. And it's by Philipp Ernst. He would have been writing these pieces for the simple system flute, not the Böhm flute, as the Böhm flute had not yet been invented. As with the European countries, the United States had many different pitch standards. While we might find instruments that play at A440, that was certainly not the pitch goal in 1776 and throughout the 19th century. As with most countries, there were pitches below A440 that were standard and various pitches above A440 that were also very common. Looking at the 19th century as a whole, the pitch average started out in the A430 to 435 range, but pitches soon developed various high-pitch standards. In the US, A446 was quite common and was used for playing in bands or playing tunes with friends. In England, the pitch of A452, known as Old Philharmonic pitch, or sometimes just band pitch, was common, and this pitch was also used in America. One of the important concepts about early flutes is that their great diversity was also linked to the diversity of the music that they played. While a one-key flute in the 19th century would not have been a good instrument to play a Bach sonata on or a Beethoven symphony, it was an ideal instrument for playing the tunes that were popular at the time. 19th century American flutes are wonderful instruments and present a very diverse picture of what music making was all about in the early years of the United States. Thank you.